Everyone is talking about the 6.2, the magnitude, the shaking, the moment it struck, the damage it did, the fright it gave a region. That is the number in the headlines, the event with a name and a size, the thing the news can point to and report. But the 6.2 is not the story that keeps seismologists awake. Because for the people who actually study the ground, the earthquake that already happened is the least interesting part of what is going on. The part they cannot stop watching is the thing that almost no one else is paying attention to, the steady, persistent stream of small earthquakes that has continued in the same area, quake after quake after quake, most of them too small to make the news, too small even to be felt by many people. A swarm of little tremors rumbling on beneath the notice of a world that has already moved on. That swarm is the story. Not because it is dramatic, because it is not, but because of what a swarm can sometimes mean, and because the history of exactly this kind of overlooked, unglamorous cluster of small quakes contains some of the most alarming lessons in all of seismology. The world is watching the earthquake that ended. The seismologists are watching the swarm that has not. Picture a seismologist at her desk in the days after the 6.2, looking not at the record of the big quake, but at a map of tiny dots, each one a small earthquake, accumulating in a cluster in the same patch of ground. To anyone else, the map would look like static, a scatter of insignificant tremors, the seismic equivalent of background noise. But she is not seeing noise. She is watching how the dots accumulate, where they cluster, whether they are creeping in one direction over time, whether they are getting shallower or deeper, whether the rate at which they appear is slowing down, as it should, or holding steady, or, most concerning of all, quietly increasing. She is cross-referencing them against the readings from the instruments that measure the shape of the ground, watching for any sign that the surface is deforming, lifting, straining. To her, this unremarkable scatter of small quakes is a text she is trying to read, a message from several miles down that may say nothing at all, or may say that something is beginning. And she knows, because she knows the history of her field, that this exact kind of unremarkable scatter has, on rare occasions, been the opening pages of a catastrophe that no one recognized until it was too late. So she watches the dots, while the rest of the world watches the number that already happened, and she keeps to herself the quiet, unprovable unease that comes from being one of the few people who understand what a swarm can sometimes become. This is a story about that swarm, the one nobody is talking about, and about why a persistent cluster of small earthquakes can be, in the eyes of the people who understand these things, more significant than the single larger quake that grabbed all the attention. Because there is a crucial distinction in seismology, one that most people have never heard of, but that changes everything about how a sequence of earthquakes should be read. And it is the difference between an ordinary aftershock sequence and a swarm. They can look similar from the outside, both of them a series of smaller quakes following in an area. But they are fundamentally different phenomena driven by different processes, and they carry different meanings and different dangers. An ordinary aftershock sequence is, in a sense, reassuring, the expected settling of the crust after a main shock. A swarm is something else, something more ambiguous, and, in certain circumstances, something far more ominous. And when the small quakes after a significant earthquake start to behave less like ordinary aftershocks and more like a swarm, that is precisely when the seismologists lean in. Because the history of what a swarm can be building toward is written in at least one recent and terrible case, in the deaths of hundreds of people. Let us begin with that crucial distinction, because it is the key to everything. When a large earthquake strikes, a main shock, It is normally followed by aftershocks, and those aftershocks follow a very predictable pattern. There is a clear largest event, the main shock, and then a sequence of smaller quakes that decays steadily over time, growing less frequent along a smooth and well-understood curve, the crust settling back down after the big rupture. This is the ordinary, expected behavior, and while the aftershocks can be dangerous, the pattern itself is familiar and, in a way, comforting because it follows the rules, decaying toward quiet as it should. A swarm is different. A swarm is a cluster of earthquakes in which there is no single dominant main shock, no one large event that clearly triggered all the rest, but instead a series of quakes of comparable size, rumbling on, sometimes for weeks or months or even years, without the clear decay of an ordinary aftershock sequence. Instead of one big quake, followed by fading aftershocks, a swarm is a sustained, restless agitation of the crust, a cluster of activity that does not settle in the normal way, that can persist and even intensify over time, that seems to be driven not by the simple settling after a single rupture, but by some ongoing process working on the fault from below or within. And that difference, the absence of the normal decay, the persistence, the lack of a dominant main shock, is what makes a swarm so different to interpret, because it suggests that something is actively driving the seismicity, something that has not spent itself in a single event, something that is still at work. What could that something be? This is where swarms become genuinely fascinating and genuinely concerning, because the processes that drive them are often not the simple mechanical settling of an aftershock sequence, but something more dynamic, more alive, and in some cases more dangerous. One of the most important drivers of earthquake swarms is fluid. Water and other fluids moving through the crust, deep underground. When fluids under pressure migrate into a fault zone, they can change the behavior of the fault dramatically, effectively lubricating it, reducing the friction that holds it locked, making it easier for the rock to slip. As the fluid moves and spreads through the fault system, it can trigger a cascade of small earthquakes, each slip allowing the fluid to penetrate further. The fluid in turn enabling more slips, a swarm that migrates and evolves as the fluid works its way through the crust. This is a fundamentally different process from an aftershock sequence, because it is not the crust settling down after a rupture, but an active, ongoing intrusion of fluid that keeps driving new seismicity as long as it continues. And here is the concerning part, because a fault that is being lubricated and worked on by rising fluids, a fault that is being progressively unlocked, is a fault whose behavior is changing, whose resistance to a large rupture may be being eroded, and a swarm driven by such fluids can, in certain circumstances, be the visible sign of a process that is building toward a much larger earthquake. Not always, not usually, but sometimes, and the sometimes is what matters. Fluids are not the only thing that can drive a swarm, and the other main driver is, if anything, even more dramatic, because it is magma. Japan is one of the most volcanically active countries on Earth, studded with volcanoes fed by molten rock rising from deep below, and when that magma moves, when it pushes up through the crust toward the surface, it fractures the rock as it goes. And those fractures are earthquakes, small ones, clustered around the moving magma, a swarm. Volcanic earthquake swarms are one of the most important warning signs that volcanologists watch, because a swarm of small quakes beneath a volcano can be the sign of magma on the move, of a system recharging and pressurizing, of an eruption potentially building. Not every volcanic swarm leads to an eruption, just as not every fluid-driven swarm leads to a great earthquake, But the swarm is the signal that something is stirring in the plumbing below, and it is watched accordingly. This adds another dimension to why a persistent swarm in Japan is taken seriously, because depending on where it occurs, it could be the expression of fluids working a fault toward a large tectonic earthquake, or it could be the expression of magma working its way toward the surface and a possible eruption. And in some settings, the two possibilities blur together, fluids and heat and magma, all part of the same restless underground system. A swarm, in other words, is not just a cluster of small quakes. It is a symptom, and the disease it is a symptom of could be one of several, some of them capable of catastrophe, which is exactly why the specialists cannot afford to wave it away as mere background rattling. Because there is a recent case in Japan itself that demonstrates exactly this, a case that should be far better known than it is. And that hangs over the interpretation of every persistent swarm that follows. On a peninsula on the coast of Japan, a swarm of earthquakes began, years before the disaster, a cluster of small to moderate quakes that started up and then, instead of fading away as an ordinary sequence would, persisted and continued and went on, month after month, year after year. For a long time, this swarm was a local curiosity, a matter for the people who lived there and the scientists who studied it, but not a national or global story, because it was just a swarm of smaller quakes, nothing dramatic enough to command wide attention, the kind of ongoing seismic activity that does not make headlines because no single event in it is big enough to. The residents felt the tremors, learned to live with them, and the scientists watched, increasingly intrigued and increasingly concerned, because the swarm was behaving in exactly the way that a fluid-driven sequence behaves, migrating, persisting, accompanied by measurable signs that the ground itself was deforming, being pushed and lifted by whatever was happening below. The swarm was, in other words, a slow-motion warning, unfolding over years, that something was actively at work beneath that peninsula, something that was steadily changing the state of the faults there. And almost no one outside the immediate area was talking about it. And then it happened. After years of that overlooked, persistent swarm, a great earthquake struck the same region, a powerful quake far larger than any of the individual events in the swarm that had preceded it, a magnitude that brought real catastrophe, collapsing buildings, killing hundreds of people, generating a tsunami, devastating the peninsula that had been rumbling with small quakes for so long. And in the aftermath, as the scientists studied what had happened, the picture became clear. The years-long swarm had not been a random curiosity. It had been the surface expression of a deep process, the rising of fluids into the crust, the progressive working and unlocking of the fault system, a buildup that had been visible in the seismicity and the ground deformation for years before the great rupture finally came. The swarm that nobody outside the region had been talking about had been, in retrospect, a prolonged prelude, a warning written in small quakes over years, a sign that the faults beneath the peninsula were being actively prepared for a major earthquake by the fluids moving through them. It was not that the swarm had predicted the exact day, because nothing can do that, but that the swarm had been the visible symptom of a dangerous process, a process that the small, ignored, unglamorous quakes had been announcing all along, if anyone had known how to read them and had been paying attention. And the most haunting part of that case is how much the ground itself was telling anyone equipped to measure it in the years before the Great Rupture. It was not only the small quakes. The land of the peninsula was actually being deformed, lifted and pushed by the pressure of the fluids accumulating in the crust below, a swelling of the ground so subtle that no human being standing on it would ever feel it, but large enough that precise instruments and satellite measurements could detect it, could see the surface of the peninsula slowly rising over the years as the swarm rumbled on. The crust was, in effect, inflating, straining under the pressure of whatever was rising into it, and that deformation was measurable, recorded, studied, another channel through which the underground process was announcing itself. So the warning was not only in the seismograph traces of the small quakes, but in the very shape of the land, in the millimeters of uplift accumulating year after year, a double signal of a fault system being actively worked from below. And still, because it was slow, because it was subtle, because it was expressed in small quakes and imperceptible uplift, rather than in any single dramatic event. It remained a specialist's concern, studied in scientific papers and monitored by the experts, but not a story the wider world was following. The ground was rising and shaking for years, telling anyone who could read it that something was building, and the great earthquake, when it finally came, was less a bolt from the blue than the culmination of a warning that had been accumulating, quietly. And the data, the whole time. That case is the reason a persistent swarm cannot simply be dismissed, and it is the reason the small quakes continuing after the 6.2 deserve more attention than they are getting. Because the lesson of that disaster is precisely that the dangerous signal was hiding in the unremarkable data, in the ongoing cluster of small quakes that never rose to the level of a headline, that never produced a single dramatic event large enough to command attention until the great rupture itself. The swarm was talking the whole time, and almost no one was listening, because a swarm does not announce itself the way a large earthquake does. It does not have a moment, a magnitude, a name. It is a slow, distributed, unglamorous phenomenon, a persistence rather than an event, and our attention is drawn to events, not to persistences. And so a swarm can build for a long time, carrying its ambiguous but real warning, beneath the notice of a public and a media that only pay attention to the big, discrete moments, until the moment it is warning of finally arrives. This is the specific danger of the swarm nobody is talking about. Not that a swarm always leads to a great earthquake, because it does not, but that when it does, the warning was there all along in a form too quiet and too sustained for most people to hear. Now, honesty demands a very important set of qualifications here, because the story of a swarm building to catastrophe, while real, is the exception rather than the rule, and it would be deeply misleading to suggest that every swarm is a countdown to disaster. The overwhelming majority of earthquake swarms do not lead to a major earthquake. Most swarms are exactly what they appear to be, a cluster of small quakes that rumbles on for a while, driven by some local process, and then fades away without ever producing a large rupture, leaving nothing behind but a period of unsettling but ultimately harmless shaking. Swarms are common in many regions, especially volcanic areas and places with active fluids in the crust, and the vast majority of them come to nothing, seismically speaking. So the existence of a swarm after the 6.2 is not by itself a reason for alarm, and anyone who tells you that a swarm means a big earthquake is certainly coming is misrepresenting the science. The honest truth is that a swarm is ambiguous, that it usually means nothing catastrophic, that it occasionally, rarely, is the sign of something building, and that in the moment there is often no sure way to tell which kind of swarm you are looking at. The reason seismologists watch a persistent swarm is not because it is likely to lead to disaster, because it is not, but because it carries a small, real, elevated possibility that it might, and because the one time in many that it does. The consequences can be terrible, and the warning, as the peninsula showed, is exactly this easy to overlook. It helps to hold both of these swarms in mind at once, the harmless and the ominous, because they are the two faces of the same ambiguous phenomenon, and in the early days there is often no telling which one you have. Japan, and the world, has seen countless swarms that rumbled for a while and then simply stopped, that frightened a region and disrupted some sleep and then faded into memory without ever producing a large quake, harmless in the end, a false alarm that was never even really an alarm. And Japan has seen the other kind, the rare one that built to catastrophe. From the inside, in the moment, the beginning of each can look much the same, a persistent cluster of small quakes that will not quite decay. That is the whole difficulty in a sentence. The swarm that comes to nothing and the swarm that precedes disaster both start as a scatter of small tremors that refuses to fade, and the difference between them only becomes clear with time. Or in the worst case, only becomes clear when the great earthquake finally arrives. This is why the watching is so fraught and so necessary at once, because the specialists are staring at a signal that is usually meaningless and occasionally the most important thing in the world, with no certain way, early on, to know which it is. So what are the seismologists actually looking for as they watch the swarm that nobody is talking about, trying to distinguish the harmless kind from the ominous kind? They are looking for clues in the behavior of the swarm itself, in its evolution over time. They are watching whether the swarm is decaying, fading away as it should if it is a settling sequence, or whether it is persisting or even intensifying, which would suggest an ongoing driving process. They are watching whether the seismicity is migrating, moving through the crust in a way that would suggest fluids on the move, spreading through the fault system. They are watching the ground itself, using instruments that can detect deformation. The subtle rising or shifting of the surface that would indicate that something below is pushing on it, inflating or straining the crust. A sign that the swarm is the surface expression of a deeper process rather than just a shallow rattle. They are watching for changes in the types and depths of the quakes, for patterns that match the signatures of fluid-driven sequences or of a fault being progressively loaded. And they are comparing all of it against a catalog of past swarms, the ones that fizzled and the rare ones that did not, looking for the tells that might distinguish this swarm from the harmless majority. It is painstaking, uncertain, probabilistic work, an attempt to read the intentions of the crust from the subtle character of its smallest movements, and it rarely yields a clear answer, but it is the best that can be done, and it is a great deal better than not watching at all. There are subtle statistical fingerprints in a swarm that seismologists read like a doctor reading a chart, and they are worth understanding because they show that the watching is not guesswork, but a real, if imperfect, science. One of the most important is the balance between small and large quakes within the sequence, the ratio of tiny tremors to somewhat bigger ones, which tends to shift in characteristic ways depending on what is driving the activity, so that a change in that balance can hint at whether a fault is being loaded toward a larger event or simply rattling harmlessly. Another is the migration of the quakes, the way the cluster of epicenters moves across the map and through the depths over time, because fluid-driven swarms often show a distinctive creeping spread as the fluid pushes outward through the rock, a signature that distinguishes them from the fixed pattern of an ordinary aftershock cloud. Another is the depth of the events and how it changes, whether the activity is rising toward the surface, as it might if magma or fluid were ascending, or staying put. Another is simply the rate, whether the swarm is decaying as it should or refusing to fade. holding steady or intensifying in a way that says the driving process has not spent itself. None of these signs is a crystal ball, and each of them can be ambiguous, present in swarms that come to nothing as well as in the rare ones that build to disaster. But together they give the specialist a way to characterize a swarm, to place it on a spectrum from almost certainly harmless to worth watching very closely, and to update that assessment as the sequence evolves. It is the closest thing seismology has to reading the intentions of a fault, a careful forensic study of the smallest movements of the crust, and it is exactly the kind of work that is happening right now on the swarm that nobody else is discussing. There is another dimension to this that deepens the concern and that connects to some of the most cutting-edge work in modern seismology, which is the phenomenon of slow, silent movement in the crust that does not produce felt earthquakes at all, but that can accompany and drive swarms. Scientists have discovered that faults do not only move in the sudden, violent ruptures we call earthquakes. They can also slip slowly, quietly, over days or weeks in what are called slow slip events, aseismic movements that release energy gradually without the sharp shaking of a normal quake, and that can go completely undetected without sensitive instruments because they produce no dramatic shaking. These silent slips are important because they transfer stress, quietly loading neighboring parts of a fault even as they release it elsewhere, and they are sometimes associated with swarms of small earthquakes. The two phenomena intertwined, the slow slip and the small quakes together, marking a fault that is actively moving and evolving. When a swarm is accompanied by signs of this kind of silent slip, it deepens the sense that something is genuinely at work on the fault, that the crust is not merely settling, but actively deforming, and it adds another layer to the concern, because slow slip events, by loading adjacent fault segments, can in principle nudge a fault closer to a large rupture. This is frontier science, uncertain and still being understood. But it is part of the reason that a persistent swarm, especially one accompanied by ground deformation, is watched with such care, because it may be the visible part of a larger, quieter process of the fault coming alive. All of this puts the seismologists in a genuinely impossible position when it comes to what to say. An understanding that Bind explains a great deal about why the swarm stays so quiet in public even among the experts who watch it. Imagine you are the scientist monitoring the swarm, and you can see that it is persisting, that it carries some of the ambiguous signs that can rarely precede something larger. What do you say? If you sound a public alarm, warn that a swarm might be building toward a major earthquake, you will almost certainly be wrong, because the great majority of swarms come to nothing, and you will have caused fear, disruption, perhaps economic damage and panic over a catastrophe that does not arrive, and you will have spent your credibility so that the next warning is heeded less. But if you say nothing and stay quiet, and the rare exception is the case you are living through, then you will have watched the warning unfold in silence and said nothing while it built. There is no comfortable path through this, because the honest scientific position that the swarm carries a small but real elevated possibility of something serious is exactly the kind of nuanced, probabilistic message that neither the public nor the media handles well, that gets flattened into either false alarm or false reassurance the moment it leaves the specialist's mouth. And so the specialists mostly do the only thing they responsibly can, which is to watch closely, to communicate carefully and precisely to those who need to know, to avoid both the cry of wolf and the silence of complacency, and to live with the discomfort of holding a real but unprovable concern that they cannot fully share without distorting it. This is part of why the swarm goes unremarked even by the people most worried about it, not because they are hiding anything, but because the truth about a swarm, small chance, serious stakes, no way to predict, is almost impossible to say out loud without it becoming something it is not. The quiet around the swarm is not only the world's inattention, it is also the careful restraint of experts who know that the honest message is one the world is poorly built to receive. So why is nobody talking about it, if it matters so much? The answer lies in the nature of attention and the nature of a swarm, and it is worth understanding because it is the very thing that makes the swarm so dangerous when it does matter. Human attention and media attention is drawn to events, to discrete, dramatic, nameable moments. A magnitude 6.2 is an event. It has a time, a place, a size, a story. It can be reported, photographed, discussed, and then, as the shaking fades and no immediate catastrophe follows, it can be filed away as over, a thing that happened and is now in the past. A swarm is the opposite of an event. It is a persistence, a slow, distributed, ongoing phenomenon with no single dramatic moment, no climax to report. Just a continuing rumble of small quakes that individually are unremarkable and collectively are hard to fit into a headline. The media reports the 6.2 and moves on because that is what the media is built to do, to cover events. The swarm continues after the cameras have left, below the threshold of what counts as news, and so it goes unremarked. Unwatched by anyone except the specialists, precisely because its danger, if it has any, is expressed in a form that our systems of attention are not built to notice. This is the deep reason the warning of a swarm is so easy to miss, not because the information is hidden, but because it comes in a shape, a sustained low murmur rather than a sharp cry, that slips beneath the notice of a world tuned to listen only for the loud, sudden sounds. And this is what makes the phrase, the swarm nobody is talking about, more than just a provocative framing, because it points at a real and structural blind spot in how we perceive seismic danger. We are wired, as individuals and as societies, to respond to the big sudden earthquake, the dramatic event. And we have built our attention and our news, and even much of our public understanding, around exactly that kind of discrete disaster. But some of the most important seismic signals do not come in that form. They come in the form of the persistent swarm, the slow build, the sustained agitation that carries its meaning not in any single event, but in its persistence and its evolution over time. And these are exactly the signals our attention is worst at registering. So there is a genuine sense in which the swarm nobody is talking about represents a category of danger that our whole way of perceiving earthquakes tends to miss. A slow warning in a world that only listens for fast ones. And the peninsula that rumbled for years before its catastrophe is the proof that this blind spot can be lethal. The point is not that this particular swarm will lead to disaster, because it very probably will not. The point is that the swarm is exactly the kind of signal we are structurally prone to ignore, and that the one time in many when such a signal matters, the ignoring can cost lives, which is why the specialists watch what the rest of us overlook. It is worth remembering, too, what it is actually like to live inside a swarm, because the people in the affected area are not experiencing a scientific abstraction, but a grinding, wearing reality that the rest of the world never sees. To live where a swarm is active is to feel the ground move again and again, day after day, week after week. Small jolts and tremors that are rarely dangerous on their own, but that never quite stop, so that the earth beneath your feet, the one thing that is supposed to be solid and dependable, becomes a source of constant low-grade unease. Dishes rattle. Hanging lamps sway. You wake in the night to another tremor and lie there wondering whether this one will grow, whether this is finally the big one. And then it fades, and you try to sleep again. The nerves fray. The sleep suffers. Children grow anxious. And there is no event to point to, no single disaster to grieve and recover from, just an endless, formless unsettledness, the psychological toll of living on ground that will not hold still. This, too, is part of the swarm nobody is talking about. The quiet erosion of ordinary life for the people who live above it, the exhaustion of sustained vigilance with no resolution, the strange burden of being warned of a danger that may never come but also may not, indefinitely. It is a form of suffering that does not photograph well, that produces no dramatic images, and so it, like the swarm itself, goes largely unremarked. Born privately by the residents of the shaking ground, while the wider world, having noted the 6.2, has long since looked away. And though this all centers on one swarm in Japan, the phenomenon belongs to seismic regions everywhere, and the blind spot it exposes is universal. Swarms occur all over the world, in volcanic zones and geothermal areas and along faults wherever fluids move through the crust, and everywhere they present the same interpretive challenge, the same ambiguity, the same difficulty of distinguishing the harmless majority from the rare, dangerous exception. And everywhere, the same structural inattention applies. The same tendency of the public and the media to notice the discrete large earthquake and ignore the sustained swarm, so that the slow warning, if it is a warning at all, goes unheard until the moment it is validated by disaster. Japan, with its dense instruments and its hard-won vigilance, watches its swarms about as closely as anywhere on Earth, which is precisely why its one recent catastrophe born of an overlooked swarm is so instructive, because if even the best prepared nation can have a years-long swarm build to a deadly rupture beneath the notice of all but the specialists, then the blind spot is real, and it is everywhere. The lesson of the swarm nobody is talking about is not confined to one peninsula or one country. It is a lesson about a whole category of seismic signal that human attention is poorly equipped to register wherever on the shaking earth it occurs. So step back and see the whole of it, the story beneath the story, the signal beneath the noise. A magnitude 6.2 struck Japan, and the world took notice, reported the event, and moved on. Because that is what we do with earthquakes. We treat them as discrete moments that happen and then are over. But in the same area, the small quakes have continued, a persistent cluster, a swarm, rumbling on beneath the threshold of attention. And it is that swarm, not the 6.2, that the seismologists cannot stop watching. They watch it because a swarm is a different creature from an ordinary aftershock sequence, because it can be driven by fluids and slow slip and other active processes, rather than the simple settling of the crust, because it can, in rare and terrible cases, be the prolonged surface expression of a fault being prepared for a major rupture, and because the history of their own country contains a recent, devastating example of exactly that. A years-long swarm that nobody was talking about until it culminated in a catastrophe. They watch it with honesty about the odds, knowing that the great majority of swarms come to nothing, that this one very likely will too, that there is no way to predict and no cause for panic. But they watch it, because the swarm is the kind of signal the world is built to miss, and because the one time in many that it matters, being among the few who are paying attention is the difference between being ready and being caught unaware. The 6.2 is the story everyone is telling. The swarm is the story that matters, and almost no one is telling it at all. And maybe that is the real point to carry away, larger than any single earthquake or any single swarm, which is that the most important warnings are not always the loudest ones. We are drawn, by our nature and by our media, to the dramatic and the sudden, to the event with a magnitude and a moment. And we tend to assume that if something matters, it will announce itself loudly. But the earth does not always work that way. Sometimes its most significant messages come not as a shout, but as a murmur, a persistent, quiet, easily ignored signal that carries its meaning in its duration rather than its intensity. And these are precisely the messages we are worst at hearing. The swarm that rumbled for years beneath a peninsula before its catastrophe is a monument to that failure of attention, a reminder that the ground can warn us for a very long time in a voice too quiet for most of us to notice. This does not mean we should live in fear of every cluster of small quakes, because the great majority of them are harmless, and fear is not the appropriate response to a low probability. It means, rather, that we should cultivate a humbler and more patient kind of attention, one that can register the slow signal as well as the fast one. That trusts the specialists who watch the murmurs while the rest of us listen only for the shouts. The 6.2 will fade from the news within days. The swarm may rumble on for weeks or months, saying whatever it has to say in its quiet, sustained voice, and whether that voice is announcing nothing or announcing something. The only people who will hear it are the ones patient and humble enough to keep listening after everyone else has stopped. That listening to the story beneath the story is the quiet, unglamorous heart of what it means to truly watch a restless earth.